Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I'm really excited to welcome Travis Goodman. Travis is based in California and is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He has been practicing over the past 9 years in both the hospital and private practice settings. He also has further expertise, training, and certification in attachment-focused EMDR, emotionally focused couples therapy, and dialectical behavioral therapy. In this episode, Travis also shares his journey of becoming a therapist and why he is so passionate about wanting to help people. Travis then walks through the process of EMDR and what it entails, which is something I believe a lot of listeners can get value from, especially if they're interested in this modality of therapy, which is becoming more and more prominent. It's something I've used in the past and I found it to be very helpful. You can find Travis on various platforms, especially Instagram at Therapy for Dads. And if at the end, if you could leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. Travis, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me. I'm super grateful for you to take the time to have this conversation with me today. And I'm just really excited to chat with you. I think we've spoken a couple of times now, and I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversations. So I'm excited for this one. But before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to quickly share something about yourself, what it is that you do, where you're located, just for the listeners to kind of get to know you.
Sure, yeah, and thanks again for having me on your Easy Conversations. I think it's such a great name, by the way. And I appreciate you inviting me on to have a conversation, an easy conversation. So I'm Travis Goodman. I'm located down in Southern California in South Orange County, married coming on about 12 years. Have 3 kids, a 5, a 3, and a 6-month-old. She's now 6 months, which is crazy. So we're just now getting out of the cave, I call it. 6 months is always kind of the light at the end of the tunnel of the newborn phase. So it's good. So we're there, which is crazy. Yeah. She's 6 months. And so by night, I'm a dad. That takes a lot of time being a parent full time. I mean, until they're asleep, you're doing stuff, and even when they're asleep, you're doing stuff. I feel like cleaning the house and putting things together and getting ready for the next day. But by day, my day job, I work as a licensed marriage and family therapist out in California. So that's my kind of my profession, if you will, out here. Yeah. So I've been doing that now for, been fully licensed for, I want to say 6 years, fully licensed for 6 years, but cool. Practicing for almost 9, because that's postgraduate school. We have to get 3,000 hours, so it's about 2.5 years it took me to get my license post-grad but you're still doing therapy as you know, right? You're doing therapy, but you have a supervisor who's kind of checking off on your cases and case consultation and everything like that, but you're doing the work. It's just someone's kind of making sure that you're doing all right. And so I guess with that, it's been about 9, well, what did I say, 6, like 8 years, about 9 years. So
cool.
Yeah,
cool. And you also have your own podcast. If you want to,
yes. Sorry,
talk about
did not mention that. Yes, I do have my own podcast, my own Instagram, YouTube. So, but podcast is Therapy for Dads with the number 4. So therapy number 4 dads. It's also the Instagram handle, and I have a website, therapyfordads.com. I also have a YouTube channel where I do a little more longer form content on mental health videos. If you just type in my name, Travis Goodman, at YouTube, you'll find me. And podcasts I've been doing for about just over a year. I did take kind of a cheat year because I took 3 months off when I had my daughter. So I started at May of last year in 2021. So I hit the 1-year mark in May of this year, but there's 3 months in there thing because I was taking care of the family. So it was just kind of that's part of being a dad. It's just priorities. So I've been doing that. It's a lot of fun. And, those that don't know, I actually just had you on my show. It's going to, for those that don't know, we're doing this in the same night. So that's what we do as dads. We double dip and, little
Well, you
trade
shouldn't have
secret.
let that out of the hat.
Well, hey, it's out.
Yeah.
We could cut this and they'll have no idea I even said it. That's the
No.
beautiful thing about post is you can cut it and it as if it never happened. It's like magic. So I had you on my show and it was a great conversation. I was really appreciative of you talking and I get to be on yours and we get to do this and share different conversations. So it's fun. It's fun. And my favorite thing, I think, from running the podcast actually and has been meeting just incredible men and women that have a heart and passion around kind of fatherhood and men's mental health. That's kind of like what my podcast has been focused around is kind of the intersection of mental health and fatherhood and men, just kind of providing space for men to have a conversation, to share difficulties, to share things they've overcome, to kind of create that vulnerability in men to share about things they've gone through, because I don't think there's enough spaces for men talking about these things, which is how the podcast was birthed, was really just trying to provide space for men to share, because men often are not asked. Going through infertility stuff with my wife and having friends go through like miscarriages and infertility issues, often men aren't asked how they're doing. Even by like healthcare professionals. It's just, how's the mom doing? Which is fine. It's not anti-mom, anti-support, but there's a theme here in general that men are just kind of in the background, in generally speaking, when it comes to these things, especially in fatherhood, in postnatal visits. Mom, how you doing? How's the kid? Which is fine. Like, those are good things. So I don't want to take away from the support and care we need for mothers and children. However, there's men have an experience and they're going through things and are often just kind of expected to just perform, kind of fulfill some of the stereotypes, and a lot of men are struggling. So I wanted to provide a space for men. And then the podcast has evolved slightly to also include kind of other experts and talking about maybe specific, like, kind of topical ideas I think men have gone through, like burnout. Has been a topic I had my first female on, who's a PA physician's assistant, and we talked about parental burnout, and how it affects men and women and the differences there, and some of the barriers men are facing with parental burnout within our society, at least in America, with like parental paid leave and things like that, and kind of just the expectations of men in our society, and how that can promote burnout. So it's kind of evolved since like day one, but I still bring on men to share these stories. I think they are needed, and we need more of it to kind of just normalize just talking about it, and which in turn I think encourages men to kind of feel encouraged to then get help themselves, say, wow, this guy's talking about it, like, I relate to this, maybe I can get help, and maybe I'm not the only one. It's kind of, in a way, kind of inception of, hey, they're hearing this stuff, and maybe they start to hear it enough to say, okay, I can get help, I don't have to be afraid or get stuck. So that's kind of what the pod came from.
Yeah, no, I like that, because that's kind of the purpose of this podcast as well, and that's why you're here, to have these conversations and normalize them, because we need to be having more of them. And I agree with you, when people hear these types of conversations, they can relate, and it gives them courage to either speak up or ask for help. So that's my goal. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for doing the work you're doing. But I just wanted to understand, not only for myself, but the listeners, what made you choose this field, and did you experiment along the way?
Yeah. So I think so my parents got separated when I was starting a senior year in high school. And that kind of just shifted things, for me, just kind of out of the blue. I had no idea. Me and my brother, it's like, oh, okay. Just kind of, there was nothing, there was no, like, they didn't fight. There was nothing, there's no signs that would have said this was happening. It was like, kind of, it felt like out of left field thinking back. You know, they weren't yellers or screamers or there was nothing like that. It was just kind of, oh, okay, you're getting separated. Okay, I remember them pulling me into the living room, standing, and I remember just staying there, and like I thought I was in trouble for something, and that, you know, sometimes I don't know why, but you know, when you're a kid or a teen, you think parents sometimes call you. Sometimes you get this feeling like, did I do something? And then you're like, did I do something? Like, what? And you're racking your brain, like, what did I do? And I'm getting called in to have this conversation and sit down. It feels very formal. So I knew something was up, and then I was like, okay, you're separated. And then I didn't see my dad, you know, once they left, it's like I didn't see him for almost a year. That was weird. My mom got depressed. So it was, my brother started acting out. I was the oldest. My brother was like, we dealt with it very differently. I became very much the dad, like the calm one. My brother got really angry and was like breaking crap all the time and doing stupid stuff at high school and, you know, like, yeah, just stuff. I was like, what do you do? And so I became like his dad, and we'd fight over it. It was just a hot mess.
Yeah.
And so that was just tough. Just senior year of high school, like just what is going on? And then out post that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought I knew what I wanted to do, and so I went to junior college, which is not a bad thing. But I think that some people can do it. Oh, you're going to junior college, not university. Because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I went there to kind of try to take just classes like I don't know. And initially, my dad, when I did talk to him again, you know, I would ask him, like, I don't know what to do. He's like, well, do math, you know, do math. It's like, okay. Because he's like, you could always get a degree with math and engineering, right? There's always, we always need more people in math and engineers, which there is some truth to that. I think he was trying his best to help provide for me in a way. And, but that was always like his thing. Or join the military, because he was ex-military. He was in the reserves, and so joined the military, which I didn't want to do. And I started doing math. I was decent at it. It came naturally to me. Like, it wasn't super difficult to do math. I was always kind of in advanced math in high school and just kind of, you know, did calculus and all this stuff. So my brain worked that way. And so I did that, and then long story short, my parents kind of were rocky for a while, and I was just kind of living my life in my early 20s, and I remember I moved to San Diego because my dad was down there at the time, and my mom, my brother, where we were still up in where we grew up, but we all moved down, and I was planning on moving anyway because I had buddies that moved down there post high school. I was like, I just want to change the scenery, and they live in San Diego. I visited them a few times. Like, hey, this is cool. It's cool. San Diego's great. It's gorgeous. It's, you know, you're by the beach. They got a lot of good food. I want to go. But my mom and dad decided to kind of try their marriage out again. So I remember moving down there, and that was really awkward. Just the house was just like just tense all the time. And I just kind of stayed out of the house and worked and was with my buddies. And then one year I moved out because I can't take the tension anymore. Like, it was one Christmas. I'm like, this is just so weird. So I'm like, I have to move out because I just feel really low in this house, just not good. I wouldn't say depressed, but definitely just heavy, you know, feeling just the energy, just like I can't think. I'm just awkward. So I moved out, and that was one of the best things. Like, financially, you know, I had to start living again. I had to pay for things, so, you know, financially probably wasn't the best move, but I think holistically for me it was the best move. Mentally, emotionally, socially, because I just got away from that tension, and I could I can breathe. Long story short, they did eventually divorce. So I was on a journey for math. Part of it was because my dad said so. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was at a university eventually, and I decided, this is not for me. I'm doing it, but I have no passion. No desire, like zero. Like, I have zero passion to do any of the homework. I don't care. I'm doing it last minute. It's just, there was no drive for me to do it. So I stopped. And I remember my dad being really upset. Like, didn't understand why I stopped. And I'm like, well, I'm not going. I'm not paying for, I'm like, you're not even paying for school. So I'm paying. And I'm not going to pay for a degree that I'm not going to use. Yeah. So I took about a year off, worked, and kind of read and just different things, and decided I actually did. So I actually studied theology, Christian theology. I found that fascinating. So I started doing that and loved it. It was great. I ate it up. I found it fascinating, interesting. Read a ton of books and actually really became an avid reader at that point. Because in high school I read, but I wasn't avid. I just kind of, it just wasn't my thing. But I really started just reading for the first time, just philosophy and all these different books and, ancient writers and from different religious backgrounds, and just kind of, for whatever reason, that just kind of fascinated me. And I loved reading philosophy. It was like, wow, this stuff's, Plato, all the the greats like Plato and Socrates and all those classics. Like they were just, to me, like, it just, my brain, like, just, I loved it. So I did that, and then started a master's degree, and then my parents finally divorced, and I'm like, oh, and for whatever reason, I couldn't focus. It was weird. It just hit me again. I was like, why is this hitting me? It's been like years of them on and off, and I just kind of let it go. But when they finally said it's final, I was like, for whatever reason, it struck a chord, and I was like, man, I'm not okay. And so I stopped that degree, started seeing a therapist who I got a referral from a friend of mine, and just started doing that pretty much weekly. And really just, I paused school. I was working still, and then I was just doing that, doing friend stuff in life. But that became like my focus, and really started deep diving into who I was and my identity and my shame and, stuff I struggled with and how I coped and how I was dealing with, like, my parents' stuff and who I was and my role as the eldest son and as a kid, and really what I wanted, and kind of the toll it took on me emotionally with my family and my father and my mom and what they went through, and just kind of just really did everything. Just kind of took a deep dive, man. Just went for it. Definitely some of the hardest stuff I've done, and definitely the most rewarding. And through that process, through my own therapy, through my own healing and restorative work of doing the stuff, of being on that end of the couch and being the one opening up and sharing and doing the work outside of therapy, and going home and journaling and writing and doing all this stuff to kind of continue my work and really reflect on why I do what I do and my motivations and my drives and all those things that we do as therapists now with our clients. I was that person, and through that I really realized, man, I really want to help people on this level, and really help them navigate some of that stuff that I went through, and be a listening ear and guide along their way to help them find restoration and healing and peace and balance in their life. So that's kind of, and then I went back and got a second degree in psychology, and then got a master's in, counseling, and then, the whole track licensure, and became licensed. So that's kind of the, I guess, medium length of a story, I guess, to answer your question of how I became a therapist.
No, thank you for sharing. And as you can appreciate, I can relate to it on many aspects. So we share that. So that's amazing. So now, you kind of used your own journey as a catalyst to want to help others. And I think a lot of people experience that in life, where they go through certain adversity and then they want to help others through that. And I think that's beautiful that you're doing that. Yeah. So why therapy for dads?
So, like anything, trying to find a handle. I was initially going to use my name, which, isn't bad, but, trying to think of something that would get people's attention. And while my YouTube channel is my name, I was like, man, but I wanted to, I guess the reason why Therapy for Dads is I wanted really to help highlight dads, fathers, and kind of mental health, which is really men, right? But the next layer of being a man is now fatherhood. Is that I think going back to kind of that, why I started my podcast was, one, I wanted dads to have space, and men to have space to talk about the difficulties, and just kind of normalizing therapy. And I used therapy in kind of really a generic, people are going to have their own notion when they hear the word therapy. It can mean an array of things to depending on who you're asking. Right. But I wanted that to kind of catch their ear, and their thought process of okay, therapy, and then they're going to have their preconceived notions, whatever it is that they're projecting on the therapy, whether it's like talk therapy or like physical therapy. I mean, there's so many different types of therapies out there, and then dads. And so I wanted that to really highlight and kind of normalize mental health and fatherhood, and be a face to that as well, of one being a dad, being a man, to say, hey, this is just mental health, mental wellness is, well, mental health is just as important as everything else that men have, like just our physical health, our social health, our intellectual health, our relational health, our spiritual health. Like these are all important factors, and one is not greater or lesser than the other, but as equal. And I think just creating space and having another face and being a licensed therapist to kind of bring good information around some of the mental illness stuff, like, okay, here's some things that I know a lot about, as well as the mental, just in generally talking about mental health and mental wellness, but having that kind of background. So that's really why therapy for dads is to really highlight men and fathers, and to really be one of the, I think, other men that are doing this, of really trying to help normalize it for dads, again, because I think dads tend to, I think men in general, when it comes to therapy and mental health, there's barriers. Then you add becoming a father, there's just a whole other layer of barriers on top, because now you just have less time for yourself. So now I'm a dad, I got responsibilities, I don't have time, and I don't have time to take care of myself, which is also why I started, because I dealt with a lot of dads coming in my office, and they had all the barriers of men, the classic stigmas of like, well, I don't want to be seen weak and a burden. But then being a dad, it's like, I got to provide, I got to do this, and became this other layer of like more barriers and more difficulties got in the way of them taking care of themselves. And so I think that's why I really highlighted that. And of course, I help anyone, but I really wanted to make a point to really highlight dads in what I do, at least on the Instagram and the podcast, is really trying to bring it back to speaking to the dad experience around mental health and fatherhood.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. Very cool. And you've touched on it a few times. The aspect of shame, now that can apply to men and women equally. But what about shame when it comes to men? And you and I chatted about it offline too, but as a therapist, because I haven't really asked even the therapists I've had as guests on the podcast, like, being on the other side, what do you typically see from the men that come to see you when it pertains to shame, and perhaps even when they take on the role of fathers?
Yeah, so a lot of the narratives and messages I hear, a lot of, like, when I get to the core of some of their shame messages, right? First we probably should define shame for your listeners, right? Guilt and shame, easy way to do this, right? Unless you've defined it already. Have you defined it already to your listeners?
No. Shame's...
No? Okay.
Yeah. Go for
So
it.
guilt and shame, easy way, just to make it simple, right? Guilt is, I failed at something. Shame is, I'm a failure. Right, that's the difference. One is about something, a behavior, something I didn't accomplish or I wasn't able to do, versus a negative prescription of self, how you see yourself. So it's not that I made a mistake, it's I am a mistake. It's not that, I didn't do enough to study, versus I am not enough. That changes everything, right? Because one, you could fix, like, easily. Okay, well, if I didn't study enough, what do I need to do to study enough for the next test? But if I'm at my core not enough, well, I can't fix that. Like, that's just, that becomes truth, quotes, I'm putting that in quotes, those who are listening, quotes. That becomes this truth, this fact. I mean, the reality is it's not, but it becomes this truth, and so everything becomes this lens. We see the world through this lens of shame. Like, I'm a failure, I'm not enough, I'm unlovable, and so everything gets filtered through this lens. And so if that's the truth of how I see myself, then therefore everything is kind of encased or shadowed by this shame message. And so a lot of men and fathers I deal with, a lot of them struggle with feeling like a failure as a father. I'm not enough. I'm failing my kids, therefore I can't, I'm a failure. And so they get stuck in this kind of spiral. And then, how they cope with it is they tend to isolate. They tend to, just work more or they turn to other negative things like drinking or pornography or something to kind of numb or just avoid or workaholic. They work 12-hour days and try to provide more. And a lot of the men, and I'm generalizing, a lot of the fathers I work with, when they come in, they don't have really good, deep, vulnerable, intimate relationships for various reasons. They tend to feel like I don't want to be a burden, so I don't talk to my spouse about it. Especially if they're married, I don't talk to my spouse. I don't want my spouse to know. And then if they're a single dad, that's they tend to be more isolated. I don't have anyone, or I have buddies that I, joke around with, but I wouldn't tell them how I feel. So there's a lot of shame even of being seen as perceived of being weak or struggling, because then that comes in with all the pretty typical stigmas of masculinity in men, and where men are afraid of being seen and being perceived as weak and not having it all together. And so they keep it hidden. And then, well, as you know, and I know, that just tends to make things worse. It tends to perpetuate the shame message and more the hurt and the pain and the unhealthy coping. It just kind of builds this pressure. And then eventually what tends to happen until they get help is that pressure, it gets to a point. We all have a breaking point. And then once we hit that, something happens.
Yeah.
And it tends to not come out in very healthy, productive ways, typically. That's usually what I've seen. So, yeah, that's what I'm seeing, and that's why I want to help men. And hey, let's help you out. Let's normalize this help and realize it's actually very manly, very strong to seek out support and connection and vulnerability.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the whole aspect of not enough, because I think that's the root of the shame, is that narrative around I'm not enough, and then to your point, that becomes our truth because we believe it. And the antidote to shame, vulnerability, is not easy either, because there's that aspect of weakness, and again, accepting failure is not something that's been role modeled for us as men. And
right.
It's not something we grew up with, right? You didn't see, we all, as boys growing up, we all had role models, whether it was athletes or celebrities or movie actors, and you didn't see them fail, right? You only celebrated their successes. So that factors in too, because that's how we were programmed.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely.
So one of the other things I did want to cover with you, and for personal reasons as well, but EMDR.
Sure. Yep.
I'm not going to seek therapy on this call, but so eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
It is. So
EMDR.
And I'll just give some context here, but I think a huge fundamental shift for me in my healing was starting EMDR treatment, and how it enabled me to not only dig deep into some of the trauma I had carried into my adult life from childhood, but it also gave me an opportunity to gain a different perspective on that trauma. I was able to see it from the lens of the people that were involved, and have forgiveness and compassion for myself, but also have compassion for the people that were involved in. And it also allowed me to have some difficult conversations around forgiveness and all that jazz. So for me, EMDR has been powerful, as I mentioned. But I also want to give listeners an idea of what that treatment is, and then also get your perspective on why it can be so powerful.
Yeah, so
And before you get into that, again, just for context, you are currently learning to specialize in this form of treatment.
Right. Yeah. So I could give a quick snapshot of what that looks like. So I was trained through Parnell Institute, which there's two big bodies that, as far as like the gold standard, as far as being trained. There's other like informal trainings which I would never do, like through PESI, which I just want to do. But the main one is EMDR so emdria.org is the main kind of, certifying body of those being certified in EMDR. And, it's been around for what, I think 40 something years. And it was discovered by Francine Shapiro by accident. That's the history. And you could, feel free to Google this stuff. And you could read about it and watch some sort of videos. But I went through Parnell Institute, Laurel Parnell, who actually worked with Francine Shapiro before she passed. And Francine Shapiro really liked the work that Laurel Parnell was doing. So what Parnell did differently, or what she added to the standard EMDR protocol, was the science of attachment lens. So it's actually, I'm trained in attachment-focused EMDR. So we add in that whole attachment, because I'm big on attachment science, and that's a big thing I do with pretty much every single one of my clients. I look back at their attachment style, with their attachment to their caregivers and parents, because I firmly believe that's a big proponent of how we then seek out connection in adulthood, for better or for worse, and to heal some of those attachment wounds, because we can heal in adults, in healthy relationships or within therapeutic relationships. We can heal with, a positive corrective emotional experience, right? We can have these, we can heal these wounds. And so I love that part, which is why I went down the path of going the Parnell route, which, people, it's two different paths. They're both EMDR, but Parnell, again, added this lens and some other modifications to the standard protocol. So I like that, and I had some people who trained before and on both, and I'm like, I like the attachment stuff. I think that's pretty cool, so I'm going to go that route. So basic training. It sounds basic, but it's not. So basic training is a lot. It's three-day weekends, 8 hours, plus 10 hours of consultation in between the second and third weekend. And this is over a 6-month period. So you have the first 2 weekends pretty much back to back. So it's 6 straight days of 8 hours of live training. You're practicing. There's experts, certified EMDR trainers there. They're going through the model, the history. You're actually practicing on each other, the basics. You kind of get a feel for what it feels like in session. And then between the second and third weekend, it's about a 6-month period. You have 10 weeks or 10 hours, which is about 10 weeks of consultation with a certified trainer in a group setting, where you're kind of going over cases. They have you really focus on a case to really go through the phases of EMDR, and then get feedback and to kind of practice. So that's basic training. So that's, what's the math, 80-something hours just to have basic training. So it's not like you took an hour class and you're now certified. It doesn't work that way. It's very intense. And I'm actually on my way of getting certified, and now I'm in the process of certification. That could take, depending on the person, minimum another year. And you're meeting minimum with a certified trainer. They call them consultants, for about, I think, minimum 25 hours of consultation, minimum. And that's like, there's minimum standards, and then often what happens is that consultant will say, they'll think you're ready, or you need more time. So there's a minimum, and there's some other things we have to do as well. There's some other trainings and some other things along the way. Along consultation that they require. So it's very rigorous. And if you meet someone who's fully certified, well, I'm not fully certified, but if it's you kind of know they've done significant work and training to be fully certified. So which I appreciate the certification process for some of these kind of fields, because if someone's fully certified, they really have spent a lot of hours and time perfecting their craft within this particular modality. And for me, EMDR is a tool it's one of those tools I wish I had right away. At the same time, it's something that maybe I did some therapy around trauma before and some other, not that I did bad work, but it's some work I did is like, it's like sometimes I was, EMDR is a power tool.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
It's like having having a power tool versus a handheld tool.
Yeah, and do you feel that, at least in my experience, it was fairly intense, but I also had to get to a certain point in my journey of therapy to be able to go that deep. Do you feel that's the case with most people?
Oh yeah, totally. So part of EMDR too, prepping and assessment is incredibly important before we jump into EMDR, because doing phase 4 is 8 phases of EMDR. Phase 4 is when we desensitize. So, and we're using bilateral stimulation to help, which helps the brain reprocess quickly, more efficiently, and helps the neural pathways. Because really, within an EMDR, those who don't know, really the brain is doing the predominant work. The brain is healing itself. Because what happens is with trauma, traumatic memories, whether it's capital T traumas, lowercase t traumas, capital T traumas are those life-threatening traumatic memories we think of classic PTSD. I was almost killed, I was shot, I was, sexually assaulted, my buddy at war got blown up in front of me, I almost died. That's what we think. That's capital T trauma, life-threatening events. Then we have lowercase t traumas, which can be, in some cases, just as negatively impactful in our mind, body, soul as those capital T traumas. And those could be things like continued neglect, emotional abuse, ongoing being in stressful situations over time, being around maybe substance abuse in a family, and or maybe experiencing domestic violence in your home, or it didn't occur to you, but you witnessed it, kind of that vicarious trauma. There's a lot of things that can cause these lowercase t traumas. Going through maybe a really tumultuous divorce, right? Things can happen. Maybe being shut down emotionally over and over and over again by your parents or caregivers, where you couldn't emote, or maybe were yelled at or told you were dumb, or things. I'm thinking of men, for example. Maybe you were told you're a baby or a wuss for having feelings and you can't cry, and so you're hearing that over and over and over again. Now that's not life-threatening, but that can, for some people, that could be very traumatic. And trauma, by Dan Siegel said this. Trauma. I love this version of trauma because you could have 10 people, and I want everyone to hear this. You could have 10 people experience the same event. Let's say a life-threatening event. Not all 10 people are going to come out with full-blown trauma and PTSD. You could have 3 people come out with full-blown PTSD. You could have maybe 2 people come out with like panic attacks, maybe 2 people depressed, and like the other just kind of like, it happened, it was hard, but I'm okay.
Yeah.
Because trauma is partly determined upon the person. And not because you're weak. So trauma is really, and Dan Siegel said this, who's one of the experts in trauma, along with like Bessel van der Kolk, which are really good people who read in book. Body Keeps the Score is a great book on this exact topic. A little intense of a book, but great book. But Dan Siegel said, really, trauma is any time there's an event that, I'm paraphrasing him here, it's any time an event surpasses an individual's current set of coping strategies, as well as it overwhelms their capacity to cope in that moment.
Yeah.
And that causes a traumatic event. Because
Yep.
we all have our current capacity of coping and regulating ourselves. So it's anything that kind of surpasses that is like a traumatic event in our mind, body, soul.
Right.
And so that's the best way to describe it. Go ahead.
And to your point, like you said, it affects everyone differently, even if it's a similar incident or situation. A lot of that's also determined by our temperament, right, and our ability to cope, as you mentioned. So, very important points.
That's the window of tolerance, right? Remember the window of tolerance?
Yes.
Yeah. So window of tolerance. We all have different windows. It's that window of tolerance of meaning what we can, our level of resiliency, and there's different things that go into our certain window, meaning that's kind of our current capacity to deal with life and stress. Like the ups and downs of life, and we all have different ranges for various reasons: temperament, personality, past experiences, past traumatic event. I mean, there's so many things that contribute to like maybe having us have a smaller window or a bigger window.
Right.
And so what we do know is with early childhood trauma, it tends to shrink our window, so we're more easily traumatized as we get older because our window is smaller. Our window of tolerance of what we can mentally, physiologically tolerate is shrunk. And so, and some people are just more susceptible for whatever reason. Genetically, there's different things that can go into that. And it's not that the person's weak or not strong. That's not anything of what it means. It's just how our brains work. So, so I'll just say, going back to what we said with the EMDR, I'm in the middle of the certification process, and it's a power tool. And to answer your question, coming back, was we have to do prep work because it is so traumatizing. Because sometimes we are re-traumatized when we're in the kind of post after the event, because what we're doing is we're focusing on a particular event. And you're thinking of, you know, the thing we focus on is what image represents the most disturbing part of the event.
Right.
You know, however, what I like about EMDR is we don't have to talk about every detail. That's one thing I like about EMDR, where some of the trauma therapies, they want you to talk about every nitty gritty detail, right? And just kind of repeat that. But in EMDR, we kind of get these snapshots, and it's your brain kind of flashing through, and we use bilateral stimulation to help the client move to get unstuck, because often we're stuck and we're disintegrated. Our mind, body, soul are disintegrated. We're kind of stuck in time and our amygdala, and we're stuck in that fight-flight response. And so we use these techniques to help move, but it can be really traumatizing because now we're feeling all this stuff all of a sudden that we haven't felt, and we're really in it, and we're kind of engaging in it. And so we really have to do, before we get to that phase, we really have to, what we call resourcing people, to make sure they can regulate themselves somewhat efficiently. Because what can happen is, after a session of desensitizing, you could have nightmares, you could have more memories can pop up, because memories get buried. It's like they get buried underneath another memory, and you remove that memory, and all of a sudden it's like, you know, a funnel that starts. Yeah, it's like there's Pandora's box, right? So we want to make sure people can regulate themselves in between sessions, and we do various things to do that. We actually do something called resource tapping. We do resourcing, kind of doing a calm, peaceful place. I'm not sure if you did that with your therapist.
Yeah, that's exactly what I did.
Yeah, which is a lot of people do that in yoga and meditation, which is kind of like you're imagining a very calm, peaceful place. But we resource tap that in. You know, we want to make sure we strengthen that connection within the neural pathway of the brain. So you can go there. We have, I have my clients practice that daily. I do other breathing techniques. I do other mindset techniques, other types of resourcing, maybe around certain, nurturing figures, protective figures, wise figures, to currently bolster kind of our internal ego state. Because part of it is really what we're trying to do is boost our internal ego strengthening and affect regulation to help stress reduction, which is very important, because a lot of us come in who are first coming into EMDR, they can't do that. So I don't jump in and start processing trauma, because I'll re-traumatize them. And that will have an adverse effect. So I really want, the first few phases are so important. It's understanding the history. How are they doing? What are they doing to currently cope? Like, if they're using drugs and alcohol to cope, like, I got to get them not to do that, because that's also going to impede the efficacy of EMDR. If they're numb all the time, if they're drunk or they're high, like, their brain won't heal. I got to get them sober. I got to get them, in some cases, some people, if they're depressed, I got to get them on antidepressants so they can, like, actually feel if they're numb. Like, we got to get them to a place where they're somewhat stable, before we jump into, like, this processing. Because for some, it could really bring up all this stuff and really dysregulate someone. So I got to make sure when someone's safe. So for some people who come into EMDR, they're like, I just want to do EMDR. I'm like, yes, I'm excited. I love that you're excited about EMDR. I love that you read about this and saw it, broadcast on the internet. But there's some work we got to do first. We don't just start doing this stuff. And some people are like, well, I want to do it. I'm like, well, we are doing it. We're not desensitizing right now, but I got to do some other work with you before I feel comfortable getting there. We have to do it appropriately, because there is a process to this. Because it's about client safety at the end of the day. Our goal as therapists is client safety.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's number one.
Yeah. No, for sure. And then I guess for listeners, if you don't mind quickly going over the process, like, I completely appreciate the prep work, but as you mentioned earlier, you work with the client to get the snapshots, and then what happens?
So you work with, so the first few phases, so it's 8 phases, right? So phase 1 is kind of the history taking, kind of, who are you? What's bringing you? What's the full history from, and at least in attachment, and I think they do it in regular, but at least in my perspective, I go back to childhood and look at, elementary school, junior high, depending on the age, but elementary school, junior high, high school, college, and I go back to relationship with their folks, and do they have good social relationships? Did they get into drugs? Like, how did they cope in childhood and adolescence? Kind of really going through kind of these snapshots and their lifespan to get a good sense of who they are. And that's number one. And part of the prepping phase is that resourcing, calm place, safe place, nurturing figures, wise figures, protective, kind of building the ego strength and, affect regulation to really prep them. And for some people, actually, they get it. For some people, just the resourcing. For some, it's just, I've had some people like that. That was powerful for them, and that was enough. Like, they're like, oh, I got this. Like, it's almost like they needed to realize that they have it within themselves, because part of it is what we're doing without them knowing it is we're tapping into that person's own strength that they actually already possess, but they don't know it. Like, it's there. It's like we're just unlocking it with them and helping their brain make the connection. Because what happens with trauma, was it? That was your experience? Yeah. It's powerful, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that changed everything once I made that connection.
Yeah. And it's amazing what tapping does. Or did you do the eye movement? Did you do lights? Did you do tapping? What did you do?
I did the eye movement.
Okay. You do this. Did you do this, or did they do the light bar? Did they have the light bar for you?
No, just this, the side.
They
to
did
side.
Standard. Okay.
Yeah.
So we could even talk about different forms of bilateral stimulation later, but resource tapping is powerful. And again, like you, for some people, that could change everything. Because part of what happens with trauma is that part of your brain, the amygdala, the right part of the brain, is not bound by time. It's in the emotional state, and so that's why we can be re-triggered so easily, where we're feeling it again.
Yeah.
Because we're disconnected from our whole being, our left side of our brain, our body, everything's kind of all over the place. But resource tapping can already begin to reintegrate everything. And when we do that, we realize, oh, I'm actually okay.
Yeah.
Because that's part of what happens. That part of our brain, that part of our traumatic memory is unprocessed, and we're kind of stuck in that place, that time. And resourcing for some people just unlocks it. And so that's part of assessment, which is incredibly important. Like, all the initial work is incredibly, incredibly important. We cannot skip it. And then there's the assessment, which is phase 3. And assessment is really assessing kind of what we call targets. And targets are really, what are the main events? What are the main distressing events that you're coming in to resolve? Like, is it a rape? Is it were you physically abused? Was it a tumultuous divorce that you can't, that you're stuck on? What are the targets? And having a target map, kind of the first and the worst. What are the earliest memories? Kind of building kind of a timeline with the individual to kind of figure out what are those memories that we want to target with desensitization, which is phase 4. So once we have a good assessment, once we have a good history, we have a good resourcing, we have good prep and assessment, we then move into a classic EMDR session, which is a desensitizing session, which is really what we do. We do phase 4 all the way up to 5, 6, 7, phase 7 in one session. So 4 to 7 is kind of all in one. We do it all in one session. So phase 4 is when we desensitize, we have a target, we use bilateral stimulation, which that's part of why that's important. It helps unlock the brain, helps left-right brain connection, and we found and discovered any form of bilateral stimulation. Eye movements is the gold standard, but we have discovered over almost 50 years of research that other forms of bilateral stimulation have this very similar effect, like, tapping. We use tappers where they kind of hold these little, handles that vibrate back and forth. Some people do audio back and forth, left, right. So, because what we're doing is it's often similar to rapid eye movement. We're sleeping is that it helps our brain process it, get unstuck. And so Francine Shapiro discovered this, that for whatever reason, these vets that she was working with, it accelerated the traumatic healing. And since we now know more about the brain, I've done research to see, what we're doing is it's very similar to rapid eye movement, which helps our brain process quickly, helps us get unstuck and move, and desensitize, meaning we're reducing the distress to the event. Right. And we do something called a SUD scale, right? Subjective units of disturbance. It sounds so formal, but it's really how disturbing is this for you now as we're kind of processing, and the goal is to get it down to a 1 or a 0, where it becomes this kind of neutral. It's no longer charged, that we say, and once we get to that point within phase 4, we then move on to phase 5, where we then install what we call a positive now belief that we know about ourselves, or positive cognition. Because part of what's happening is we're stuck in our past. We often have a negative belief about ourselves, or some negative, view in the trauma, like I was weak or I deserved it. Something where it's definitely not positive. And when we reduce that, we then often, what comes to light is some positive belief, like I'm okay, I made it, I'm safe, I am strong. Like we our brains start to see the reality versus kind of the skewedness. And so then we install that meaning, we highlight it, and we also use back and forth bilateral stimulation to kind of strengthen that, because bilateral stimulation not only reduces disturbance to negative events, it also helps our brain strengthen. It's helping our neural pathway connect faster. This is all very scientific. It's all very fascinating. And it kind of feels like a Jedi mind trick, if I'm honest. It's like, in fact, I've had people tell me this, like, did you Jedi mind trick me? I'm like, kind of. I mean, that's a good way to describe it. I mean, there is some science behind it, but it kind of feels like magic. I've had people say, did you do magic on me? Like, it doesn't bother me anymore. It's bothered me for like 15 years, and it just, it's not there. It's not like you don't forget the memory. It's not brainwashing. It's just you think of it, and it's almost like how I describe it. It's like you had a wound that was gaping, and it just scarred over for the first time. So you remember it, but it's not oozing and painful anymore. It's like, oh, the scar's there.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Based on everything you've explained, like, when the amygdala takes over, our primal response is fight or flight or freeze.
Right.
And then basically with the tapping and the bilateral movement, as you've explained, we're getting our prefrontal cortex activated. And that's how we're rationalizing everything and making sense of it. And that's why it's so important to have those positive. But I guess you could look at it as a trick, or just utilizing the right parts of our brain.
That's the layman. I mean, because to them it feels like a trick. You know, if you be on the other end, because I know as a therapist, like, oh, that's what I'm doing to the brain, and this is what's happening. But the person going through it, it's just like, wait, what? Why? How is this? How is this working? You know, especially because they've often been stuck in the thing for years. And so once we get through installing, we then do what's called a body scan. After we install like the new belief, right? And body scan is phase 6. And that's important because sometimes there's still residual stuff left in our body, because our body, has memory and will still store some stuff. And so we have them scan. And if there's something left over, some sensation, we is it a positive or is it disturbing? If it's positive, we kind of, oh, great, let's strengthen that. If it's disturbing, we might need a little more work, meaning there's something else still there. And we kind of clear that out. And then we go to kind of closure, which would be then phase 7. We kind of wrap up the session. And then phase 8 is the next session we reevaluate, because this is what can happen when we end a session. I've even had this where sometimes, and this is, so EMDR is not always clean every session. We don't always get someone's disturbance down to a 1 or a 0 with a memory. Sometimes we get them down, maybe it starts at an 8, we get them down to like a 6, and that's the best we can do in that session. So we kind of button it up, and then the next session, we're going to start here next time. And what can happen sometimes is within the week, they come back and it's like, oh, I don't know, it just feels less now. And it's like a 2 now. And because what's happening is it's almost like the brain got unstuck a little bit and then continued the healing work in between sessions. It's like it's still healing because it was stuck, and now it's starting to move like on its own. And part of what we do too within that phase in between sessions, like, hey, keep a journal. You might have new insights, new memories, new dreams, new things may come up for you. Write them down, because we know that the brain, it doesn't stop healing. It's always moving. And what we did, we just kind of got it out of the mud a bit, and now it's starting to kind of roll. So some things can still work in between sessions, and some people have epiphanies afterwards, and then it's like their brain just continues healing. So all we're doing is aiding the brain with these scientific techniques to help it get unstuck and help, like you said, get out of the amygdala response, help reintegrate with the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, reintegrate with our body, right, and our cognition. We're really hitting every part of ourself, our left, right brain, our body, our amygdala response, and helping calm, which is why we resource. We're really kind of hitting everything within EMDR. And that's why I love it. I love it because it's a very powerful tool, and it is a tool. It's a tool.
Right. Right.
And it's very, very powerful. And but we really got to do the work to prep people in order to engage it, to make sure they're safe. Because again, that's going back to that. It's vitally important that we really prep people correctly to do the work, so they can continue to heal. It's a tool that I wish I had early on, but it's one of those things that's part of my journey, and I did other things that got me to where I go, and I finally did EMDR, and I'm loving it, and it's like, it's fun. I could use it pretty much with most people, even even with resourcing. I pretty much resource with everybody now, because I'm like, hey, it's so powerful. It's like, let's just resource. I mean, it's great, and on top of all the other techniques I do. So EMDR is great, and if you get a chance to do it, it's find a good therapist. Again, not everyone needs EMDR. I want to say not everyone has to have it.
Right.
But for those who do, it's a powerful therapeutic. And there are other good therapeutics out there. Other people that are trained in different types of trauma therapy. EMDR is not the only one. There are other ones out there. I gravitated towards it primarily because of the lower level of disturbance with people. Like, you still get disturbed sometimes, but I don't have to fully re-traumatize and go over everything, because there's other modalities like that kind of cognitive one. I'm thinking, what's the cognitive trauma therapy where you're kind of and you're really like writing every nitty gritty detail, and I'm like, I don't know if I believe in that version. I feel like it just is more traumatic than helpful, and that's why I love EMDR. Is we need snippets that activate the brain and the body, and then we just kind of go. So we don't, which I like, is we don't have to fully go over every detail, because the brain already knows it's there. Like, the body knows it. So we don't need to kind of fully get discombobulated. It's like, let me get what are the main points, and then the body, the brain knows it exists.
Right.
Like, even talking about it, it's like you already activated that memory, even thinking about it. It's like, oh, it's there. I don't need to have you explain every detail. So, which is what I like about it, is that I feel like it's more client centered in a way. I think a little, I don't know. That's my thought. My perspective.
I agree. I found it to be powerful, and I did find the insight where I was able to reprocess things a lot easier, as you mentioned. But I guess in between sessions, there's also the risk of, as you mentioned, you could take the client from 8 to a 6. And they can come back as a 2, but there's also the risk that it can go the other way, because you're uncovering so many things, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Oh, it could totally get more, because then now they're thinking of like 5 other things. Or what can happen is that memory, they didn't realize there was some other earlier memory that was more traumatic. It's like we have think of like memories of like channels, and sometimes we drop into a channel and it goes way down, and we're like, oh, there's something here.
Yeah.
Which is why assessment is so important in history taking, because we don't want to be blind. We try not to be blindsided. We really want to know everything, so if something does come up, we're aware of it.
Yeah.
Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes the client forgets something, and then we drop in. I mean, we still have techniques to get out of it, but sometimes that could be very traumatic, because it's like all of a sudden it's like boom, it just hits them, and they're in it. And which is why we want to really be aware. But yeah, there are times when people can feel more, which is why we do preparation and resourcing, because it's to help them in case they get more disturbed or more stressed, so they can take care of themselves, through different techniques, calm, peaceful place, meditation, exercise, good eating. We kind of really make sure that they have the skills and they feel confident to use them, so they can regulate, especially if things go up in between sessions. Because that goes again and back to the first 3 phases of EMDR. They're vitally important, because we know it can increase the disturbance in between sessions. In fact, a lot of times it does. People can have nightmares, especially if there's complex PTSD. Yeah. Especially if there's a lot of stuff. That's where I tend to see it. People who don't have a lot of if it's like a single incident, I tend to not see that, at least in my experience so far. Yeah. But when there's especially like early childhood physical, sexual abuse or things like that, when there's more complex trauma, at least the first few sessions, I tend to see sometimes the increase in disturbance for a few sessions, because there's a lot of layers and the brain's kind of trying to keep up with all this stuff. Yeah. again, this is kind of anecdotal, experiential evidence that I've seen. But I do think some of the research does speak to that as well, from what I've read. Some of the readings I read from Shapiro as well as Parnell have kind of mentioned that. So, yeah.
Cool. No, thank you for sharing all that. That was very, very helpful, and I'm sure listeners will get a lot out of it too. But yeah, no, and I'm being mindful of time here, so. How can people reach you? I know you talked about your handle on social media, your YouTube channel, but I just want to reiterate that for listeners, and I'll definitely be sharing all of it on the show notes, as well as putting it out on Instagram. But
yeah. So again, the website, if you want to go everywhere, is Therapy for Dads. Therapy with the number 4 dads.com. That's the Instagram handle. That's the podcast show. On YouTube, if you just type in Travis Goodman, that's the best way. But again, one-stop shop is just the website. You click on the links, and it'll take you anywhere you want to go. So yeah, check me out. Again, I'm a therapist in California, so if you want to do therapy, I can't do that if you're outside of California. It's a weird law, just FYI. I've had some people reach out to me. I'm like, I would love to, but there are rules. I can't do therapy across state borders or countries. It's just how our license works currently. One day maybe that'll change to open it up, but that's just as a little small FYI. Now I can do coaching, but I can't do therapy. So I can't do EMDR with you unless you're in California. There's very clear laws about that. So, yeah.
Well, no, thank you for sharing that, Travis. And thank you for coming on the podcast. Sharing your story and walking us through the process of EMDR. That was very, very helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm excited about it. So blessings to you and to your listeners, and hopefully they do find this helpful. Hopefully it wasn't too, I don't know, educational or too classy. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like it could be over the head, but.
No, it was great. I think it was great to walk through it. I've mentioned EMDR many times on the podcast, and I'm sure people have heard about it otherwise too. So it was very beneficial.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for having me on.
Welcome.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode. As always, please subscribe to the podcast if you enjoy the episodes, or leave a comment in the comment section. I always love hearing from you. Thank you again, and until next week.